Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. It is Thursday and quite dreary in the nation's capital, but I am here with Niall to brighten the days of our viewers, right?
We will brighten it from these dismal weather conditions to a whole other brighter outlook all across the political spectrum.
Yes.
And so to kick us off in that respect, Robbie, what's on your radar?
You're going to like this one, Niall. Conservatives and libertarians, I think, are correct to draw attention to all sorts of reckless spending within the federal government. President Donald Trump has deputized Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. DOGE has recently fixated on the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, which spends billions of dollars on foreign aid to other countries. Foreign aid is a very unpopular category of government spending, even though the American people mistakenly believe that it constitutes a very large proportion of overall spending. It makes sense to more closely scrutinize USAID's activities, for absolute certain. However, some of the critics of USAID have seized on a misleading claim, namely that the organization was funneling millions of dollars to Politico. In reality, it appears that government workers were paying for subscriptions to Politico's premium product. Now, that may or may not be a worthwhile use of government funds. More on that in a moment. But at any rate, it does not represent some kind of direct subsidy to the news outlet. Now, many conservative social media personalities seem to feel differently. On Wednesday, right-wing pundit Benny Johnson, among others, circulated the rumor on X that Politico had received $8 million from USAID. Johnson clearly thought this was a big story. He appended the caption, "Biggest scandal in news media history," with no further qualification. Johnson also speculated that without such funding, Politico would go out of business. Adding fuel to the fire was an apparently unrelated mishap concerning Politico's payment processing services. Due to a technical error, employees of the news website were not paid for the most recent pay period. Kyle Becker, an independent commentator on X, implied that this had something to do with Musk shutting off USAID payments. Suddenly, all the Trump-critical coverage that has appeared at Politico over the years seemed like part of some deep state plot funded by American taxpayers in order to spite the MAGA movement. Quote, "Everything makes sense now," wrote Becker. Fortunately, these theories are based on a little bit of a misunderstanding of how Politico's business model works. First, the $8 million figure represents total government expenditures to Politico since 2016, not USAID dollars specifically. The amount paid by USAID to Politico totals $44,000. A government agency directly transferring cash to a journalistic outlet that's supposed to cover it impartially might still constitute a scandal. In general, the feds should not subsidize journalistic projects. But importantly, USAID was not generously donating the money to Politico. The government paid the money in exchange for subscriptions to Politico's premium content. This is a pretty important difference. USAID is paying for the service Politico provides in much the same way that a government agency has to pay for janitorial services, electricity, or office supplies. If a federal office buys a new printer, that isn't necessarily malicious. It could be malicious if the printer costs too much money or is defective or was purchased as part of some kickback scheme. But the reality that government offices need printers, well, that's not really up for debate. When confronted with these facts, however, many of the conservative social media accounts asserted that something must be awry since $44,000 is still way too much for a Politico subscription. Well, look, that's assuming that USAID is overpaying in exchange for favorable coverage of progressive causes and unfavorable coverage of Trump. But that's not what that agency and other government agencies are actually paying for. In truth, Politico's premium product isn't political news coverage, progressively slanted or otherwise. It's minute-to-minute updates on regulatory decisions that impact specific industries. This is information that political and government agencies need and that Politico supplies for a premium price. As independent journalist Lee Fong points out, Politico isn't the only game in town. Bloomberg and LexisNexis run similar services. Politico's price tag is comparable with theirs. Quote, "Politico provides paywalled pro-subscription services that cost over $10,000 per login for up-to-the-minute detailed reporting on policy decisions and regulations," writes Fong. The 8.1 million in Politico subscriptions referenced above relates to years of subscriptions by agency officials across the government, end quote. Now, these services are clearly valuable. In fact, Republican legislators pay for them too. Customers of Politico services include Representative Lauren Boebert, Representative Elise Stefanik, and even Speaker of the House Mike Johnson. Republicans want their staffers well informed of important policy and legislative updates. Corey Whalen, a communications director for former Libertarian Congressman Justin Amash, notes that it would be both impractical and ultimately more expensive to expect legislative staff to gather the necessary information some other way. In a day and age where subscriptions to news and entertainment products cost individuals in the range of $10 or $20 a month, I understand why people were suspicious of subscription costs in the thousands of dollars. But the pricing tiers for organizations, look, they're simply more expensive. For instance, consider X. I'm a subscriber to the X service. An individual seeking the perks of official verification on X can expect to pay $3, $8, or $22 per month, depending on the desired level of premium access. For business and governments seeking verification, the cost for full access is $10,000 per year. Now, maybe government agencies should be pooling resources more aggressively, like family members all sharing one Netflix account, but that'd be an issue of government efficiency, not some attempt to pay Politico for favorable coverage. None of this, now, by the way, means that either USAID or Politico are blameless entities. It's entirely fair to criticize Politico for slanted coverage. For instance, no outlet is more responsible for foisting on the American people the lie that the Hunter Biden laptop story constituted Russian disinformation. In October of 2020, after the New York Post published the story in question, former national intelligence experts signed an open letter declaring that the laptop resembled Russian disinformation. But Politico went even further, publishing a headline that made this claim much, much more strongly. Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo, dozens of former intel officials say. Now, when Joe Biden was asked about the laptop during the subsequent presidential debate, he dismissed it with reference to Politico's false characterization of the letter. This was a massive error on the news outlet's part, but it is not explained by some secret financial payoff on the part of USAID.
Good radar, Robby. You were quite right in predicting that. I do indeed agree with all of that, I think. I mean, I think it is to your credit, seriously, that from a right-leaning perspective, you're willing to call out the fact that the stuff that's been put out is simply not true. It's an obvious misrepresentation. And even the idea about subsidizing things. You know, people are no more subsidizing Politico by buying a subscription than someone at Goldman Sachs is subsidizing Bloomberg by subscribing to the terminal. They are paying for a service that is provided. And in this particular case, it is part of obvious reasons that people need information to do their jobs. That's the price of the subscription. People can argue that one way or another, but that's what the price is. Now, here's the thing that worries me, among other things. This has gone so far that Trump now is, I was going to say tweeting, he's writing on Truth Social about it, in fact. And he's talking about the fact that the left-wing rag known as Politico seems to have received $8 million. He goes on to say this could be the biggest scandal of them all, perhaps the biggest in history.
That's what Benny Johnson said too. Yeah.
Yeah, Elon Musk saying similar things. So
people are really, really getting over their skis on this one. And if conservatives are to maintain their credibility in finding areas of government spending to cut, which I do think is important, and I think there are all sorts of things USAID was spending money on that it should not be spending money on, and that's fine, but we have to be proceeding from the same basic set of facts. And I think people who were jumping to criticize this also didn't quite understand what the subscription is for. The information in the premium packet is again, minute-to-minute updates on regulatory decisions that are coming down. The congressional staff want access to, right, so they can advise their member, even from the conservative standpoint. That comm staffer I cited, Corey Whalen, she worked for Justin Amash, who's a libertarian Republican before that. They want to know so they can brief their member and say, okay, you want legislation to, it could be a conservative thing, to cut government, to do any of these things, but they need that information. And then other people are well, isn't that their job? Shouldn't they be getting that information? That would cost them more to do that service in office.
Right. No, I agree with that, but I think our one point of differentiation here is that it seems that you think the Benny Johnson type people were from a conservative perspective, but genuinely mistaken. I am not at all so convinced of their sort of good faith. I think this is actually fake news in the way that term used to be used, deliberately spun up news. And I think it is people using, in a rather cunning and disingenuous way, a claim that I think they're too smart to actually believe, as a way to gin up outrage and to draw attention. And it has now spun out of control to the point where we have the President of the United States writing about it on social media.
Yeah, gotta gin up outrage over things that are actually outrageous.
Yes,
is
exactly.
What I would advise my friends on the right to do. Coming up, we'll discuss Nancy Mace's latest outbursts in Congress. Stay tuned.